Welcome, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. I'm Catherine Sisk, and I work at the National Office of the Presbyterian Church in Canada, and I'm the Senior Program Coordinator in Justice Ministries, which focuses on a number of intersecting social justice issues. Thank you for taking time out of your day to join us for this webinar, which is going to address the affordable housing crisis in Canada. It's 101. Let's begin. Ainsley, can you start the slide deck?
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, so can everybody see the deck? Perfect. So my name's Ainsley. I'm the executive. I've got two hats. So one is I'm the executive director of Evangel Mission. So we're a Presbyterian mission with 2 housing properties, and we're in the process of expanding. And the other hat is I'm the redevelopment advisor to the Presbyterian Church in Canada. So that's sort of twofold. Half of that role is supporting the National Congregational Office to think through some of what are some policies and programs and ways that the National Church could support individual congregations to include housing in their redevelopment plans? And I also spend time working with churches one-on-one who are considering at the very early exploration stage, is housing right for us? Do we want to include it in our redevelopment plans? What would that mean and what does that look like? So I work with individual churches and sessions and committees to think through some of these things. And I'm available to any Presbyterian church that's interested to sit down and talk by Zoom. All right, so I just want to talk a little bit about what is the housing crisis and why are we here? What's happened?
Sorry, Ainsley, can I just start with the land acknowledgement?
Yes.
Is that okay? Thank you. Sorry.
No, sorry.
We're gathered today on many different lands that have held and continue to hold significance for hundreds of Indigenous nations since time immemorial. I am working today on the lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee and Wendat people, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. The Presbyterian Church has apologized for its role in operating residential schools and the harms caused to Indigenous peoples, families, and nations. As we meet today to discuss the housing crisis, we acknowledge that the Church has been complicit in colonization, a system driven by actions that dispossessed Indigenous peoples from their lands and homes, and recognize the ongoing harms this has today. In the Church's apology, we make fundamental commitments, including continuing to listen to Indigenous people and tell the truth about the past, respecting Indigenous spiritual traditions, many of which are tied to the land, and to support Indigenous-led healing and wellness initiatives and being in solidarity with Indigenous peoples and communities. Some of the information and ideas we address here today can help our faith communities to lean into these commitments as we consider and talk more about the housing crisis and as we consider ways that the Church and congregations might respond to these in light of the commitments. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And that's really important. It's something that we talk about at every board meeting is what does this relationship mean, both as Presbyterians and as a housing provider that's looking to expand. So the goals of this presentation is I'm going to talk a little bit about what the affordable housing crisis is, help deepen our understanding of what some of the needs and supports are, and consider ways that faith communities can respond. So Catherine's going to talk a little bit later, but we have a long history with housing. These are just a selection of properties in the GTA. 2 are EHM residences, the other 4 are Presbyterian churches, but Presbyterian churches have been strong leaders in housing. And I'm going to explain a little bit about why that's sort of pulled back and why it's reemerging again and why this is back on everyone's minds. So what is a housing crisis? Strictly speaking, it just means that more people need housing than what's available. It means rent is taking up most or more than half of a family's income. And it also means that housing isn't appropriate for people's needs. So people are not in the size or the functional or the functionality of their apartment or their home, or they're not in the right community. So why do we have a housing crisis now? So I'm going to start a little bit with policy and economy. Building new homes is not elastic. So what that means is when you have a lot of changes to a community very quickly, you can't just build lots of homes to meet that within 6 to 12 months. It's not elastic. It requires planning. It requires years of planning, which means you need to have a good understanding of what changes are going to be coming to a community before or in the early stages that it's happening. And sometimes we do a good job of that, and sometimes we don't. Another reason is government policy is uncoordinated. So the right hand is not talking to the left. So this is a great example. Immigration is an example of this, where you've got someone like the federal government who is opening doors for really important reasons for new Canadians to come to Canada. But then where the gap is that when you've got new Canadians settling in communities where there is enough planning for housing, that becomes a problem because there's just more people who need housing than that community. It can happen with students. It can happen with seniors. It happens, communities are always changing. Demographics are always changing. And the challenge is that when you've got one branch of government changing policies that end up encouraging or discouraging where people settle in a neighborhood or in a province or in a city, but then you don't have other governments working to try and make sure there's enough housing in that community. Policy builds homes, politics build voters. So one of the challenges is that we really need some pretty bold, strongly committed policies that have long-term returns, but our electoral system doesn't encourage that. It encourages elected officials to make short-term recommendations, easy choices, easy policy changes. And so there isn't really an incentive to make long-term investments. We've also seen a huge shift away from a strong government role in the planning of building houses. So most of Canadian housing was built between the 40s and the 90s, and that was heavily influenced by the federal government. It looked different in different decades, but the federal government was either actually building housing or investing money to build housing or creating policy and incentives to encourage housing. And when I say housing, I mean everything from single family homes to townhouses to multi-unit rentals. Most of it was really built between the 70s and 90s. I think it was about 60,000 units of rental housing were built between the 70s and 90s, and the federal government was really driving this. In 1994, everything changed. The federal governments decided that they were no longer going to be involved in promoting housing development. And so they downloaded the responsibility for housing down to provinces and municipalities. So for example, we'll talk a little bit about all of the housing that Presbyterian churches built in the 80s and 90s. Those were all done with federal programs, but the federal government said they didn't want to be involved in anymore, downloaded it to the provinces. The provinces now manage these programs, except in Ontario, they also downloaded it and said, we also don't want to be in the business of housing, and downloaded it to municipalities. So Ontario has some of the most stringent, challenging rules around controlling how buildings that were built in the 70s, 80s, and 90s can be used. And it's been very, very challenging in Ontario, but that's an example of, government sort of throwing the ball back and forth. And right after 94, we went from the most amount of rentals being built to the least amount of rentals being built in Canada between the 90s and the 2000s. And, when you leave, that's not to say that market-built housing isn't a good thing, But when you completely leave the design of homes and communities and neighborhoods to the open market, they're going to naturally focus on plans that create short-term profit, and those don't really align with social equity and long-term goals. So when Canada was doing really well with building, it was a combination of government and market. So market could create some sort of short-term profit goals and housing that maybe is really only good for a small subset of people, but the government was also making sure that there's all sorts of other types of housing for different incomes, for different needs. And so you really need them both. And when the government pulled back and left it to the market, one of the challenges is that the market wasn't really planning communities, they were planning profit. There was also a shift in government policy, whereas in the 70s, 80s, there was a lot of focus and support for rentals. And then around the 90s, that really shifted, and it was really shifting towards promoting home ownership. That was really the goal, and they really pulled back on rentals. That really just wasn't something they wanted to spend a lot of time or money on, and so home ownership became the goal. Unfortunately, home ownership put us in a situation where we ran out of homes to own. We don't have enough housing, but we stopped building all of those rentals. So what's the impact? Rents increase, and higher income earners are moving into lower income communities. Lower income earners are being pushed out with nowhere to go. So another example is housing is not being planned for people. Seniors are a really great example. So seniors really need housing that supports aging in place. This is housing that can accommodate mobility devices, everything from bath bars, walk-in showers. There's also, a lot removing stairs, not having stairs. Aging in place is a really critical thing that's required for seniors. I think everybody is familiar with the need for long-term care beds. We're also seeing folks who have complex mental health issues. So in the 1970s and with the Canada Health Act, there was a real shift for really important, really good reasons. We really shifted away from institutionalizing or hospitalizing pretty much anybody for any reason we felt we wanted to institutionalize them or hospitalize them, to completely the other end, where the burden to prove that someone needs to be forced into care is quite extreme. And I think there's a lot of really good reasons for that. The challenge is that we are struggling to figure out how to provide housing for folks with complex mental health issues. I think one of the things that we've really come to understand among Indigenous communities is the impact of multi-generational trauma and the impact on mental health and well-being and one's ability to be able to, effectively stay employed and maintain a certain amount of responsibilities around housing. Folks who have been experiencing multi-generation trauma really struggle quite a bit in housing. And then when we had a lot of deeply affordable rentals and rooming houses, a lot of these folks, this wasn't necessarily the best place for them to be living, but they at least had a place. And it really allowed folks to at least just kind of manage their illness, whether it's a physical illness or a mental health issue. And one of the challenges is that as all of these really affordable rentals and rooming houses disappeared, there was nowhere else to go. So now we have an increase in folks who have complex mental health issues without housing, and that's making it worse. It's accelerating addictions. We also have the opioid crisis. And there's an increasingly poisonous drug supply, so it's becoming very, very easy to become very, very sick if you are using. And then again, as rooming houses have been torn down, we're seeing folks struggle and their addictions are worsening even more because they've now at least lost that minimum amount of stability that they had. So one of the things that's really important that I've really come to see is one of the impact is having all of this scarcity of housing really creates an us versus them. Some of the things I've seen is a lot of victim blaming. Well, that wouldn't happen to me because I make good choices. I'm never going to be unhoused. My kids won't be unhoused. So the problem is that there are 1,000 reasons that have nothing to do with someone's choices that has led to them ending up in a situation where they're unhoused. But it's a lot more comfortable if you can, for people to feel that somehow I'm not at risk if that person over there was unhoused because of their own choices and their own fault. I think that there's some very clear psychological explanations for why we do that, but that's something that is happening, is that we're very quick to blame people for their choices rather than seeing people as victims of systemic issues. It's also fueling a lot of racism and hate-based dialogue. A lot of blame is being put on, for example, immigrants and new Canadians. And it's really ignoring systemic issues that we're in a position where we've got groups of people fighting each other around for the little amount of housing that's available rather than working together and fighting the system. And a great example is I was talking to a congregation about converting their property into a combined sanctuary with housing around it. And one of the members spoke up and said, well, I don't understand why we're giving all this money or all this housing to drug dealers. My own daughter can't even afford it. And the reality is that she's right. We need housing for both people who have substance uses and people who are working but just can't make enough to make ends meet. So we really need to be thinking about, rather than a piece of the pie and carving it up, we need to be figuring out how to expand it and create more housing for everybody. And as soon as you start losing out on housing, you're seeing a worsening mental health crisis. The substance use crisis is getting worse. You're seeing gender-based violence. This really peaked during COVID, when a lot of women had nowhere to go and stayed in violent relationships. Seniors also are victims of abuse and violence. Also, loneliness is a big one, and racism, discrimination. So all of these things existed before the housing crisis, but they're being worsened, and you can't pull them out completely separately because they're worsening because of the housing crisis. So what does affordable housing mean? I think everybody's been listening to this in news and radio, and I want to explain how it's being used. It is a catch-all without a standardized or clear meaning in most situations. But it's also, when it is defined, a policy that's being used to encourage new building and to encourage people to include rentals in their building. It's also being used as politics and branding, where a politician can say, we're going to fix it with affordable housing, but without a definition. No one's really clear. So it sounds really good, but no one actually really knows. If you just say affordable housing, sometimes it can be very unclear about what someone is actually referring to. So this is a standard concept, the housing continuum, that's used by the Canadian Mortgage Housing Corporation, and I've adapted it a little bit for EHM. So if you start from the left and you move to the right, if you start with people who are homeless, they're unsheltered, they're sleeping in parks, they may also be in couch surfing, where they're sleeping on couches or in a mattress on someone's floor, but it's not really their home. So that's true homelessness. Then we've got emergency shelters. So that's where you can have a 24-hour shelter. Maybe it's a designed overnight shelter with beds, or a 24-hour drop-in center where you're not really supposed to sleep, but you can at least go in. So we've got your emergency shelters. Then we've got transitional housing, and this is housing that is designed to help transition someone out of homelessness and give them some of the life skills and supports and maybe help to stabilize their health until they get into an apartment while they're waiting. Transitional housing often is usually less than a year. There's not a lot out of it. Some of the challenges, and so for example, one of EHM's buildings was originally transitional, but there is nowhere for people to transition to, so it's now just permanent housing. Then you've got a world of intensive support. So then you've got long-term, like residential mental health facilities. This is like long-term care, folks with really advanced complex mental health issues, very serious addictions issues, people who need 24-hour care or on-site security, on-site staff. Then you start, you can get into supportive housing. So it's less like a hospital and more like a heavily supported apartment building. They would have some supports that could maybe come to your unit, help you clean, help you cook, make sure food is delivered, but it's not as intensive as, say, long-term care. So supportive housing is really important for folks with complex mental health issues and addictions. Supported housing is slightly different, where it's independent living. Folks are expected to be able to live independently, but they may need some supports from time to time. So they may qualify to have a personal support worker come in, maybe do some light cleaning, help them change their sheets. Maybe they need some food delivery. They can move around themselves. They can answer the door. They can pay their bills, but they just need a little bit of extra support just to keep up with the responsibilities, like, making sure you are, you're reporting damage to your unit and that you're keeping it clean. Then we've got social and nonprofit housing. And this is examples of housing where a lot of Toronto community housing, public housing, it's subsidized housing. So someone who's in it pays a much lower level of rent. They don't get any supports. You get an apartment, that's what you get. And then you have affordable housing. So affordable housing isn't subsidized, but it's not as high as market. So it's a little bit in between, and you don't get any supports. It's really meant for more, for lack of a better word, middle income earners or middle class workers. So and then at the other end, you've got market rent. So if we don't have enough affordable housing, then you've got folks who might be able to afford it stuck in these other areas. So there could be folks in transitional housing, and there could be folks in social and nonprofit housing who could actually live independently. They don't need much in the way of supports. They just need a cheap apartment. If you don't have enough affordable housing, there's nowhere for them to go. So they take up spaces. So an example like Evangel Hall, we've got a building that's social nonprofit housing. It's got some supports on site. We've got folks who really don't need to be there. They could live fully independently. They're employed, they're going to school. They just need something affordable. There's nowhere for them to go. So they're taking up a space in one of our buildings, which means we can no longer pull someone else from the shelter system, which means the shelter system can no longer bring in more folks who are unhoused. So you can see how it gets blocked up. So financially, what does it mean? So these are, down the left-hand side are a couple of examples of affordable housing. So one definition is 30% of your family income. So if your income's $50,000, what should be affordable for a one bedroom is $1,250. That is traditionally how we've described affordable. One of the other ways that we've been talking about affordability in governments is 80% of your average market rent. So, I mean, you just take the average market rent for a community. So, for example, in Toronto, a one bedroom, 80% of your average market rent is $1,715. I don't know why that number is 1,372. Sorry, that's a mistake. But effectively, by using that definition, an average market rent unit would cost $1,715 a month. Another measure sometimes it's used is median market rent, in which case it would be 1,520. There's new as you can see, that's still far higher than 30% of your family income if you make 50,000. So cities like Toronto are creating new formulas that combine market rent, local income, and family income. So what they've said is for someone who is earning 50,000, a target for affordability should be 1,378. And then for people who are on social assistance, you can see, again, this is an Ontario example, but for Ontario Works, the amount of rent you get is $390 for Ontario Disability Support. The maximum rent you can get is $599. And if you're on old age security, if you're between 65 and 74, you get $740. And if you're over 75, you get $814 towards your rent. But if you look at market rent for, and this is just a room in a rooming house or a hostel, 1,126. A bachelor is 1,400. Even if you use affordable, like the average market rents, they're still far, far beyond what someone on social assistance in Ontario could possibly pay for. So you can see, even though we have, quote, affordable rentals that we're trying to build, it won't even come close to creating enough units for people who are on severely restricted income. And this is the same example, but for a family of 4, 2 adults, 2 kids, you would get, if you're on Ontario Works, just over 750. And if you're on if you've got a disability, it's just over 1,100. And that is well beyond what you could afford in Ontario, in Toronto, for an affordable rent definition. So what is the cost of homelessness? Well, if we subsidize a month, $306 a month for every unit of social housing, we're talking $306 compared to it costs $2,250 a month to provide someone with a shelter bed. So it is cheaper to provide housing than it is to provide shelter services. So how do we fix it? What do we need to build? Everything. So we need affordable, deeply affordable and subsidized, supportive with mental health supports and addiction supports. We need long-term care. We need residential facilities. We need centers for harm reduction and addictions treatment. One of the places where we really need this is for seniors, because one of the challenges that we're facing is, and we've experienced this at EHM, is that addictions don't care how old you are. We have a number of seniors who have had active addictions, and there's nowhere, when they were ready for long-term care, there was nowhere to send them. The wait lists were 18 months because long-term care centers were not accepting anyone with an addiction, because they weren't equipped and they didn't have the resources. So we had individuals who were seniors in wheelchairs with an addiction who needed long-term care, trying to live alone in a residence without any kinds of supports, even close to what they needed. So this is happening increasingly. Accessibility. The other thing is multi-generational family units. A lot of urban centers are really struggling with even having enough units to meet single families, never mind multi-generations of families who are wanting to live together. So one of the challenges that we faced when we started having conversations with churches about would you consider putting housing on your in your redevelopment projects? And I was met with a whole bunch of euphemisms. Oh, we're a middle-class neighborhood. We'll donate to EHM, but we don't really want to include that type of housing in our neighborhood. And it was really hard to hear because it didn't align with who I know EHM tenants are. You know, if someone has intense needs or an active addiction, we would want to keep them downtown where they have access to mental health supports, where they have access to addiction services. But we also have a ton of tenants who are very independent and they just need a nice place to live, close to a park where they can walk their dog, their kids can go to a school. And we just realized how much misinformation and stereotypes there are about who actually needs housing. So we created this campaign, and I am going to do my best to share. If it doesn't,
but next day is a new day with new blessing. Cuban coffee is a strong coffee, and I use this time cubita for cubita coffee. If you want coffee, I do it. Well, I arrived to Canada on May 15, 2005. I worked for a lot of years in a telemarketing company, 8 years, 9 years. The company closed. I went to unemployment. For that reason, first I went to a shelter in Dundas and Bathurst. After that, I went to a transitional housing for 6. And one day, manager tell me, we have here a bachelor if you want. I told to her, no, I don't need see nothing. I want it. Now it's my home, is the place where I live with peace. A mí me encanta tener cosas de color rojo. Es el color de la pasión, del amor, y yo lo considero lindo, ¿no? We don't need a lot of things for stay well. And since I am here, my health condition, like my migraines, are much better. This life is a step by step by step, step by step. And this country is a country of the possibility. You can to do with your life whatever you want. My dream was teach again. Was hard, take time, but I do it. This is part of my life. I think don't exist words in my humanity for express my gratitude to this organization. Really is amazing, very well organized, put attention of the people, help to the people. I have my own space, but I can socialize with a lot of activity that we have here. Coffee time, movie time, in drop-in since 9 to 12:30. And this is so nice because always you are learning about others. And I love this. In my volunteer job, I am helping now to the chef here in Evangel. Chef Monique teach me do that. Cook for others, for me, something that I love because share the simple things in this life. If you give kindness, you go to receive that. In my 20 years here, helped me in so many ways. I feel gratitude every day, every day. When you put the onion in cold water, you don't cry when you cook. Don't cry. But next day,
sorry. So now I'm going to pass it back over to Catherine.
Thanks, Ainsley. Thank you for that that overview of affordable housing and the crisis, the causes, and some of the things that help explain what's going on with that. So how can the church respond? We're going to turn now to questions about not just how we can respond and what the church but also some of what the church has said and done. But before we do that, I'd like to consider questions about why we respond and the scope of what justice seeking looks like. Can we go to the next slide? So what does justice mean? I mean, we are people of faith and we're rooted in the biblical call to do to seek God's justice. And that quote from Micah summarizes it quite well. But what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with God? But we could, we could do an entire webinar just on understanding what justice means and how different people perceive what that means. We have a subordinate standard of the Presbyterian Church in Canada called Living Faith, and it's a document that's rooted in the biblical principles, and it outlines what various aspects of our faith have meant in the Presbyterian Church in Canada. And there's a section in it that deals with justice. So you can see bullet 1. The first bullet reminds us that the call to justice is persistent and pervasive. God is always calling the church to seek justice in the world. The second bullet says, places justice in a worldly context of concern for the well-being of other people and gives us some scope and language to describe what is entailed in the concern for one's well-being. So it requires us to seek well-being, and it even gives us examples of saying it's concerned with employment and education and health. And it uses terms like rights and responsibilities to talk about justice and how and the work of seeking justice. The third bullet acknowledges the role of structures or systems in justice seeking and the role that it plays in promoting or having barriers to one's well-being. Part of the call to do justice is to work to remove systemic barriers. So it says God's justice can be seen when we deal fairly with each other and strive to change customs and practices that oppress and enslave others. And the last bullet deals with power dynamics. It addresses power dynamics, and it says that justice demands the exercise of power for the common goal. So it stands with our neighbors in their struggles for dignity and respect and demands the exercise of power for the common good. Taken together, we get a picture of justice as being concerned with people and with the systems that shape or limit people's options or choices, and that justice work is concerned about seeking for the common good of all. Next slide, please. So what has the church said and done about housing? And I'm just going to start with a content warning. The language on this slide reflects the time and context in which they are written. So the quotes are taken directly out of different acts and proceedings of the General Assembly, which is the highest decision-making court of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. They're written in their original form for the sake of clarity, but I think it's important to see context in its original form. But you might see me censor myself as I read some of these things. So 1961, the church calls itself to directly meet housing needs through establishing facilities for senior citizens. 1965, the church advocates with provincial governments to study the needs regarding housing and education. And then in 1966, the church uses language that gives some principles around the importance of decent housing for all people. And that second quote there, this was a recommendation in 1966 that was adopted by General Assembly, and it encourages courts of the church to ensure that Indigenous people in Canada are treated without discrimination and to work with governments to take steps that recognize the disparity between housing situations for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And it's encouraging courts of the church to advocate with governments to close the gap. And we'll spend a minute taking a look at some of what that looks like today, the gap in housing disparities for Indigenous people versus non-Indigenous people in just a moment. But the 1968 quote looks at systemic barriers. And it means, and it takes a look at what some groups it includes a reference that some groups face increased barriers to housing security. And it names some of those groups. So it talks about people who are on low incomes and people who are unemployed and people with fixed income and people with disabilities. Next slide, please, Ainsley. Thank you. I want to pause for a second at taking a look at the sort of the timeline of what the church has said and done over years. And those are just select things. There's a lot more history that one could go into. But I did want to lift up one of the reasons that I included the 1966 reference is because I wanted to take a moment to consider that today Indigenous peoples are still disproportionately represented in housing disparities. These statistics are from the 2021 census, and it shows a snapshot of what some of these disparities look like. So in 2021, 1 in 6 Indigenous people lived in crowded conditions that was not suitable for the number of people who lived in that dwelling. Indigenous people were more than twice as likely to live in crowded housing. Even acknowledging that the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous populations has narrowed a little bit between 2016 and 2021. And Indigenous peoples were almost 3 times more likely to live in a dwelling that needed major repairs. These disparities have ties to the historic and ongoing impacts of colonization. And if you'd like to know more about the church's role in colonization, there are resources I can share with you after that presentation, but it's important to lift this up, particularly in context of the church's roles and responsibilities for healing and truth healing and reconciliation. So we're going to move to the next slide, and then we'll take a look. This is our last slide of sort of a snapshot overview of things that the church has said and done regarding housing over several decades. The 1973 quote is interesting because it's not just the church encouraging itself to attend to housing needs directly, but it also highlights spiritual needs. So it says presbyteries and congregations are urged to become more involved with senior citizens, both in provision of housing and in meeting social and spiritual needs of the elderly. So for me, that broadens the scope of what justice looks like, because it's not just the provision of housing as a need, but it takes a look at somebody as a whole person. The 1987 and 2007 examples are, again, the church is advocating with the government for systemic responses, for the government to address housing needs. You can see that it's in the 1987, again, identifies the crisis of housing even at that time. And here we are again in 2025 talking about using that same language. The 2022 quote is from a report that lifted up a lack of affordable housing that was a critical barrier to people who were seeking to leave domestic violence. And it was written in a time when we were during and coming out of the pandemic and lockdown, which deepened the vulnerability of people who were trying to leave domestic violence. And it speaks specifically to some of the specific needs for people in those situations. So increased priority access, short-term financial assistance to find safe housing, services that are trauma-informed and victim-centered and culturally appropriate, meeting the specific needs of people, and not just sort of a one-size-fits-all sort of approach, but it's really important to tailor the services that are being offered to the needs of the individual. The example from 2025 is taken from a letter this year that was written by the moderator to the federal government about changes to policy and immigration. And it was addressing misinformation and asking the government to not further deepen misinformation and the myth that refugees are somehow responsible for the housing crisis. They're not. These last 2 bullets in particular, they take into account a broader definition of justice that we were taking a look at in Living Faith, where justice isn't just about the provision of housing, but it's also about addressing people's wellness, which includes principles such as appropriate supports and meeting specific needs, and lifting up and address the need to lift up and address stereotypes, myths, and stigmatisms about people who face housing insecurity, because such stigmatisms work to dehumanize people. When people are seen as less than human, it's easier to minimize, to ignore, and to judge. How we talk about people directly impacts how we treat people. And so addressing misinformation, stigmatism, and racism is critical to how we treat people, but it in turn reflects that vision of justice that are not only where needs are met, but also that responds that shapes our society in ways where all people can flourish. So the second to last slide. The concept, yes, in God's backyard. Ainsley was talking about this in her presentation. I'll let you speak a little bit more about this, Ainsley.
Well, I think that in general, we're all familiar with the concept of NIMBYs, not in my backyard. And there's just been a real shift towards, yes, in my backyard. And then I think one of the things that, churches are really talking about is, yes, in God's backyard, in our backyard, whether it's our church that we want to redevelop and put housing in there, or whether we know that there's a development coming to our neighborhood. Let's support it. Let's encourage it. Let's be positive about it, because we need all sorts of housing for all kinds, for all people. And I just think this is such a really powerful role, whether it's building or whether it's encouraging and supporting and advocating. There's just so much opportunity here.
And our last slide has some resources to help. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about the redevelopment work that you're involved in, Ainsley.
Yeah, so any church that is interested in considering redeveloping and, could housing be included? What would that mean? What would that look like? Where do we even start to think about this? If you're just at the contemplative stage, you can reach out to me and I would be more than happy to come and have a conversation. It could be a quiet, off the record, exploratory conversation. It could be a formal presentation to a session, or maybe you've got a development committee that you've struck that you want to get some input on. And so what I've been doing is really supporting churches in the early stages. And then as they move along, and projects actually start taking shape, and they're starting to look feasible, and this may be a really neat redevelopment project, I'm connecting these folks, these churches, with professionals who can help them. There's also some funding to help churches through the Presbyterian Church in Canada to help individual congregations do some of that initial work, because there is a lot of financial studies and little things that you need to do before you can figure out what's possible. And so there is some money available on a grant basis currently through the PCC's National Office, and I can help connect on that as well.
Thanks, Ainsley. And so 2 resources that I would point people to for education and advocacy: the Social Action Hub. You can see the website, the URL on the slide there. The Social Action Hub is all of those not statistics, but all of that timeline that walks you through the history of the church's responses to a number of social justice issues, but including housing, is available through the Social Action Hub. It's also a place where new resources get added and links to partner organizations get added. So it's a great place for engaging with church statements and policies and the history of social action work, and particularly on housing. But there's also an advocacy page, so templates for letters to government and examples of letters for folks who want to engage in advocacy. There's a page that dedicates to that, and there is a section in that for housing in particular. And last but not least, I would also highlight that for folks who are sort of thinking about next steps, your faith community has come to a place where it says, yes, housing is a priority. We want to engage with it. We're not sure where to start. Ainsley and I will be back on November the 25th, and we'll be talking about, or Ainsley will be talking about, how do you connect with resources in your communities? What questions can you be asking? What resources and supports are available there? How do you connect? Who are the stakeholders? So making these connections will be the focus of the next webinar on November the 25th. And also wanted to do one lifting up of National Housing Day in Canada, which is November 22nd. So participating in that webinar is a great way to lift up and participate in National Housing Day. That's the end of our slide deck. Ainsley, do you have anything else that you want to add?
No, I'm just happy to answer questions.
Okay.